In this episode, I'm joined by Adrian Freedman, and Adrian has an illustrious career in what is termed, well, I'm not going to actually say in the genre of music, because there's been a journey. Adrian is currently embarking on quite a transition, I think, although he would probably say it's an evolution from one or a number of music genres into somewhere that for him is becoming really quite profound and really quite special. And we're going to head to that destination in a short while. So, Adrian, I mean, just take us back a few steps before we kind of get to that point. I'm talking in code here for everyone listening. They'll think, Neil, what are you talking about? But to take us back a few steps to some of the sort of earlier genres. So for those of you listening who don't know Adrian Freedman's work, Adrian, just kind of give us an essence, if you like, of the early days of Adrian, and we'll kind of then, I guess, sort of come on a journey up to current day and explain kind of where you are. But where did it all begin?
Hello, Neil. I'm very happy to be here chatting with you about music. Music is my life. It's the only thing I've ever done ever since I was a little boy. And when people think of music, there's so many different ways that simple word can land with people. Classical music was very important to me growing up, but I also was interested in jazz music, and I played the trumpet. I was interested in big band music, swing jazz, Glenn Miller and Archie Shaw and Count Basie, Duke Ellington, these kinds of bands. But I also loved big orchestral classical music. And as I got older, I just found that I was curious about all kinds of music. I ended up playing drums in a rock band. I became interested in Celtic music, Irish folk music. I played various instruments. Piano was my first instrument, and then violin before I became really focused on the trumpet, which I played in orchestras and jazz bands. But I was always thirsty for new sounds, new forms of music. And I went to college and studied music. And while I was there, I became very interested in sort of avant-garde contemporary classical music. But also I was interested in music from other cultures, strange, exotic instruments and sounds. Now, when I was in those formative years, when I was a music student, we're going back to the 1980s now, there was no genre of what is now known as world music. If you wanted to hear music from far-flung places, you couldn't simply log on to the internet and search for music from Nigeria or Korea or Peru. You'd have to seek this music out. You wouldn't find it on the radio. You wouldn't find very much of it performed live. And so these kinds of exotic musics were usually found in obscure record libraries, ethnomusicological departments in music colleges. And so I was very much in this world seeking out unusual sounds. And as part of that journey, I came across Japanese music, and in particular, a Japanese flute called the shakuhachi. So yeah, there are two sides to the shakuhachi. One is this very traditional context in which the shakuhachi is associated with Zen Buddhism and with Zen Buddhist practice. And in fact, there's a particular school of Zen Buddhism in which the monks use the shakuhachi as part of their daily meditations. And so there's this very strong traditional context for the music, which opens up to a whole sort of world of spiritual teachings from Zen Buddhism. But the other side of my relationship with this instrument is that I've always been a composer and a creative musician. And so at the same time as studying the traditional Zen music, I was using the shakuhachi in collaborations with other instruments and other musicians in sort of collaborative projects. And so since that time, when I found myself in Japan, the shakuhachi has continued to be a source of great inspiration for me with regard to its associations with Zen Buddhism and spiritual practice. And it's also continued to be a great source of inspiration simply as a musical instrument, which opens itself to all sorts of wonderful connections with other sounds and other musicians.
It's a very interesting beginning of the journey. I mean, the way Adrian sort of talks about this is coming from almost a sort of a variety of world music, as if we call it that, world music schools, and kind of schools of thought as much as the actual performance and the actual playing of the instrument. This feels to me, when Adrian speaks like this and describes those kind of, I guess, early steps and early days that has brought him in this direction, it kind of feels like there is much more to this than simply and purely the music. You know, when you talk about various kind of traditions that are sort of embedded behind the shakuhachi, for example, this is more than purely just sound, isn't it? There's a kind of a flow of energy or something else that's going on here, which is quite fascinating.
Yeah, that's right, Neil. And I think what this connects to is a world of spiritual teachings from various cultures in which sound is recognized as having a very primordial essence with regard to understandings about consciousness and how our senses, our emotions, our cognitive abilities help us to deepen our awareness of who we actually are. And a lot of the great spiritual questions about the nature of life and death are addressed in the context of the nature of sound. When you look at the origins of a sort of creation myths, even in the Bible, where it says in the beginning was the Word. And in Sufi traditions and in Vedic traditions, ancient Chinese traditions, many Aboriginal and indigenous cultures, the very nature of sound is considered to be a kind of portal through which we can enter into deeper, sort of mystical, non-verbal awarenesses and understandings about the nature of the self, the nature of reality. And so I'm very fascinated by this aspect of sound, because when we think of music, music has many functions. Music can express emotions. It can help to give color or flavor or mood to a story, as in a soundtrack for a film, for example. It can be used for celebration, for dancing, or for mourning. It can be used in a devotional context. But there's something about the very pure nature of sound that appeals to me, because it seems to offer an invitation into some very profound and subtle truths. And the Zen Shakuhachi was recognized early on by these Buddhist monks as a kind of portal or way into refining our understanding about the nature of the self, particularly the relationship between sound and silence. So, for example, in Zen culture, there's a lot of emphasis put on the space between things. So if you think of Japanese culture, you might think of various activities such as the tea ceremony or flower arranging or calligraphy. And in all these practices, it's the space between things which is important as much as the thing itself. So, for example, in ikebana, or Japanese flower arranging, you might think just taking some flowers and arranging them in a vase is a beautiful practice in itself. But when the ikebana practitioners are arranging the flowers, they're very much looking at the space between the flowers. And it's the same thing with sound in this context, thinking about where the sound emerges from and what is left after the sound disappears. This is a very sort of nuanced awareness about sound, which goes far beyond its simple expressive capacities.
This is getting people thinking. I mean, anyone who's listened to Adrian's work will know that there are, I guess, choreographed moments of pause and reflection between pieces. I mean, if you are fortunate enough to see Adrian play live, Adrian's moments of reflection in between each of the works that he performs, you'll kind of know this to be true. There is this wonderful sense of emptiness, but complete fullness when you're in one of these moments, because you think, okay, the piece has finished, Adrian has stopped playing, but there's still something happening. There's still something moving. There's still something energetically going on in that silence. It is quite a fascinating journey to go on as a member of the audience. And I would certainly encourage everybody, if you haven't listened to Adrian's music or come across Adrian's music before, I'll put some links in the description, because it is quite profound. It's almost that you can't, as somebody listening to this, you can't avoid it. It's not those things is like you press the pause button on a normal piece of music, popular music or classical music or whatever. This kind of music that Adrian's referring to, and I'd like to kind of sort of come back to me if you want to challenge on this one, Adrian. But as a listener to the shakuhachi, is in the form and the way that you play it, is that it's immersive in the truest sense of the word. I know a lot of people will have their favorite artists and they'll listen to them and they'll think, oh, I'm completely immersed in it, but it's immersed in the sound. There's something different in terms of a mindful experience that's happening when you actually listen to the shakuhachi performed in the way that you perform it, because it is the spaces give it this beauty and this depth that you just don't hear anywhere else. This isn't something that a Western ear is really used to, is it?
No, it's not. It's interesting you say that, because when you go to a concert of classical music, it always strikes me as a little bit odd that people listen in total silence to every note that's being played, whether it's a string quartet or a symphony orchestra or whatever. And as soon as the music finishes, people break out into raucous applause, sometimes before the last note has even died away. And this is very different from when you're listening at home to a piece of music on a recording. And when the music finishes, you're left with this silence, and you can reflect on the sounds, and the frequencies, the vibrations of the music can continue to echo within your being. And we lose this opportunity when we're in a live situation and people break out into applause in this way. Now, when I've played my shakuhachi in concerts, I've quite often been invited to play at classical music festivals or in a kind of classical music setting. And I've invited the audience to remain quiet between the pieces and not to break into applause, because the space between the sounds is such an important aspect of the music. And in that kind of classical context, you can feel sometimes people very uncomfortable and nervous with the sound and with just the idea of sitting there silently. People get a bit twitchy and they don't quite know what to do with themselves. Whereas if you take this music and you put it in the context that it's intended to be played in, which is in a meditative setting, then the silence starts to take on a completely different context, because what's happening is that the sound is like a funnel. The sound is focusing our awareness. And then once the sound dies away, and the shakuhachi has a particular way of playing a note that fades imperceptibly into silence. And when that happens, it's like our ears have become so focused on the sound as it dies away, that when the sound disappears, our ears are left wide open. And in that wide open state, we have a kind of expanded awareness. And so the music starts to have a different function, which is not so much to express things through sound, but rather to open into what lies beyond the sound. And this links to these ancient spiritual understandings about how cosmic sound is the origin of all creation. And in the same way that we have a individual sense of ourself with our lives, our families, our history, our likes and dislikes, our physical body. But if we engage in spiritual practice, we are encouraged to deepen our awareness of the self such that we can start to understand that the field of universal consciousness is actually more a true expression of ourself than our limited individual self. And the goal of a meditation practice is quite often to drop this sense of an individual self with all the attachments that come along with it, and rather redefine the self in a much broader context. And this is the meaning of the essential meaning of the teachings of the Buddha, which is that our true awakened self goes beyond the limits of our individual incarnation, and being able to access these more universal aspects of the self actually bring deep healing, comfort, and understanding. And so music has this very profound function to play in this context. And what we find is that as we drop into this silence, the music is helping us to develop more refined, more nuanced capacities to listen. And the act of listening to physical sounds, to vibrations in the air made by musical instruments or by a voice, becomes transformed into something much more subtle, a much more deeper sense of listening, almost like a kind of soul listening. And this very profound aspect of music is something that really is deeply fascinating to me and resonates with, I think, my earliest impulses to want to make music. But it took a long time for me to become aligned with these teachings. Complete that thought, because growing up in the Western world, when you play music, all of the emphasis is upon mastering an instrument, mastering a repertoire, learning scales and exercises, practicing technique, so that you can simply play music. Whereas in this other kind of context we're talking about, it's a much deeper intention that lies behind the musical practice.
Yeah, I was just wondering there. I'm a very visual person. As you're describing that, I'm kind of picturing the meaning of the difference really to your descriptions versus, I would say, and I'll put myself in this category, the average person who is probably on a spectrum of music appreciation. So if at one far end of the spectrum, let's say on the far left-hand side, you have somebody who is listening to music, maybe playing music, experiencing music of their choice, and they are experiencing something that takes them somewhere. So maybe this is a distant memory, it's the sense of how they felt in a particular moment in the past. It's a very kind of almost subconscious awakening of a memory. And then towards the middle of the spectrum, there are people, I would suggest, who are literally listening to the music for the kind of the physical pleasure of that music in the moment. So it just feels right, whether it's a particular chord, a particular progression, a particular piece, or particular artist who they just subconsciously feel connected to. There is just an appreciation of that in the moment. Now, to me, and I've never thought about it this way before, on the far right-hand side of this spectrum, in the way that you're describing it, there's another place. And this other place feels as though, okay, it's not tapping into a memory. It's not actually the experience of the music itself. It is very much, and I loved the way you described the silence after the music, allowing your ears to be open. There's almost this kind of real, true openness that doesn't have a a time-bound nature to it. It doesn't actually need any sound. It doesn't need any stimulation. It is just a moment that is complete and utter presence. Have I got that right? The way that you've described that, is that really what we're looking for here? Is that pure presence?
I think complete and utter presence is a beautiful way to describe this, because that is really the end goal of a Zen meditation practice. Meditation is a very broad term, and it can be used in a general sense to mean simply sitting quiet and finding a moment of calm in a busy day. It could also be used in a more specific way, where certain elaborate meditation practices allow visualizations of various kinds of deities or different dimensions of consciousness. But in Zen practice, all of those ideas are resolved to a very simple intention to just simply be present. And the reason for this is so that we can experience the fullness of life in its most essential form. There's a phrase in Buddhism, which I'm sure you've come across. It's from the Heart Sutra, the Prajnaparamita, and it says, form is emptiness and emptiness is form. And this connects to an idea that is associated quite often with Buddhism or Zen Buddhism, and that's the idea of emptiness. Now, in a Western concept, in a Western context, the idea of emptiness could be seen to be a little bit almost nihilistic. It's like, oh, there's nothing. What's the point in nothingness? But actually, emptiness in this context refers to more a potential for fullness. If you consider that you have a vessel like a bowl or a jar or a jug or a glass, if it's got things in it, then it's already kind of half full. It doesn't have the potential to receive so many new experiences, so much new content. But if that vessel is completely empty, then it's pregnant with the possibility to receive the maximum number of new experiences or insights. And so this phrase, emptiness is form, form is emptiness, implies that the more empty we are, the more receptive we are, the more capacity we have to become full. And this is not simply a dry intellectual concept. It refers very much to the heart and the soul and the very essence of our humanity. When we're full of ideas and we're full of emotions and we're full of thoughts and memories and feelings and ideas, projections, hopes and fears, then we can start to feel a little bit sort of overloaded. When we start to empty out all of these things and experience ourselves as a more sort of simple, essential nature, then what we find is that our very feeling of who we are becomes expanded. And so this idea of complete, utter presence allows the fullness of our hearts to express whatever emotions may be there without attachment. So we can experience a full range of emotions in any particular point in time. And we can also, at the same time as that, experience complete emptiness, complete stillness. And it's difficult to put these ideas into words, but I hope you're getting a kind of impression of what I'm sort of trying to refer to.
Yeah, certainly am. And I think I come back again. It's the third time I've said it, which is people, you have to see Adrian perform live, because there was a difference. And I think I just want to kind of put a sort of an example around what you've just said there, because the pieces of music that you were playing when you were playing your Shakuhachi with Ravi Freeman, this particular event that I'm thinking of, and you were playing a number of different pieces, and at face value, you could listen to those pieces and you could say, wow, that was beautiful. That was lovely. But then given the additional piece of silence at the end, you came out of the moment when the next piece was to start, or there was a little piece of a narrative and a story then before the next piece that you were playing, and you just came out thinking, wow. And it was that difference between, oh, that was nice, and wow, that was silence. It was nothing. It was nothing that created that step change of impact. And I think, again, we keep saying about this kind of Western audience, this Western kind of way of thinking. How can nothing be so profound? I mean, it's quite a philosophical question, isn't it? But it was such a difference between, just being, that was a beautiful piece, and being, oh my goodness, I've just been moved by nothing here. There's nothing. It does take some getting your head around, doesn't it, really? Or maybe that's the point. Maybe you don't get your head around. You just accept that it is.
Well, I think there's several things that occurred to me when I listened to what you're saying, Neil. One thing is, I'm very inspired by your comments, because as a shakuhachi player and as someone who's spent a fair number of years immersed in this tradition in Japan, there are some pretty rarefied concepts and some pretty intense disciplines that we have to embark upon and immerse ourselves in order to get close to this music and be able to really embody the music. But when I play my shakuhachi flute to people who've never heard it before, it's very inspiring to realize that these ways of perceiving sound and silence are so easily transmitted and understood by the person listening. And in a way that links very directly to the reason that we're here talking, because my practice as a musician is not simply to stay in my room and have these esoteric, rarefied experiences about the nature of sound and silence, but it's rather to share what I've experienced and what I've learned and what I've found to be a benefit in my own healing and meditation practice, to share this in a whole range of different contexts, taking my music into incongruous settings and playing shakuhachi music for people who've never heard it before. And then they have experiences like the one that you've described. And this gives me a lot of encouragement and inspiration to feel that this music has a genuine power and benefit to be shared. And it gives me a lot of motivation to know that just playing a few simple notes on an instrument like this can have such a profound impact on the listener. And the other thing that occurs to me when I was listening to you speak is about how the primordial nature of sound is not simply a philosophical concept to be found in ancient scriptures about the cosmic nature of creation. It's something much more direct than that. Because when we are a child in the womb, the very first experience we have of the five senses is the sense of hearing. We hear our mother's heartbeat, and later we hear other sounds coming into the womb from the outside world. And the sense of hearing awakens before the sense of sight and touch and smell and taste. This means that even before we enter into the world, we hear it. And at the other end of life, when we pass away, it is understood in different contexts that the sense of hearing is the last sense to disappear. And there are two ways that I can illustrate this. One is that people working in hospices with dying people, they know very, very well that the sense of hearing usually remains intact when all the other senses and faculties fade away. I experienced this when my mother was passing away, and also when my father was passing away. And the nurses would say to me, when my father was lying there in the very final stages of Parkinson's disease, in the last hours of his life, and he seemed to be in a catatonic state, the nurses would say to me, if you get close to his ear and speak to him, he can still hear you. And they said the same thing about my mother when she was in the final stages of her life. And in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is known as the Bardo Thodol in Tibetan, but is translated as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the literal translation of Bardo Thodol is the liberation by hearing. And the Tibetans understood that when somebody passes away, even when they leave the physical body, and this gets a little bit mystical here, but even when the brain shuts down and the heart shuts down, and to all intents and purposes, a person is dead, their sense of hearing remains in the room. This is a very sort of a mystical concept, but the idea is that the sense of hearing is a bridge that carries us from the material into the non-material state. And so when we're born, we have this sense that hearing is what brings us into the world. And when we die, hearing is the sense that carries us as a bridge into the next world. And so the Tibetan Book of the Dead is a set of prayers and guidances that is intended to be read to a person as they're passing away, but also in the moments, in the hours and days and weeks after they've passed away. These incantations are still made in the understanding that the essence of the person lingers and can still, in some way, maintain a contact with those of us that are in the living realm through the sense of hearing. So when you have an experience like the one that you're describing, I feel that what it's touching upon is this extremely profound nature of the relationship between our sense of hearing and our very sense of life and existence and consciousness.
We're touching on some fascinating areas here. I mean, it was really interesting actually, because when we decided we were going to have this conversation and agreed that we would not script this in any shape or form and just kind of flow and see where it went. Well, I mean, I always get so entertained myself personally with this because I have no idea where these conversations are going to go. And I would never in a million years have predicted that we were going to end up just where we are now, but also interestingly, seamlessly into, I guess, what could be described as maybe life beyond Shakuhachi for Adrian, where there is a kind of a new, I mean, not necessarily at the exclusion of Shakuhachi, but a new kind of dawn, I guess, of a new kind of conscious experience through music.
Okay, so let me give you a little bit of biographical detail, Neil, to introduce these new musical elements in my life. When I was living in Japan, I was very deeply immersed in this world of Japanese music and the other projects that I was doing. And then completely out of left field, unlooked for and unexpected, I met some Brazilian musicians who were traveling in Japan. And they came from a community deep inside the Amazon rainforest. And they were in Japan to lead ceremonies, healing ceremonies, sacred ceremonies, ceremonies of devotional singing, healing songs, songs of spiritual inquiry, songs that were very much about receiving messages of connection to nature and to spiritual dimensions, and messages of emotional healing and of community healing. And the music itself was very, very simple. They played songs with guitars and maracas. It's not the kind of music that I was really drawn to at that point in my life, but there was a kind of a very special healing energy that surrounded the music and surrounded these people and the ceremonies that they were leading. And I found myself very drawn to this and very absorbed into this world. And interestingly, it was not so much the music in this case that really drew me in. It was the experiences that I was having around my own healing. And at that point in my life, I was someone who was functioning very capably as a musician, but on a personal level, I had a lot of sort of issues that had not been addressed, and they were sort of sitting to the side, doing their thing in the shadow realms, waiting for a time when they could be addressed. And the ceremonies that I took part in with these Brazilian musicians, they allowed me to enter into a new aspect of my own healing journey, in which music played a key part, even though the music was unlike any music that I had really been engaged with before, because it was so simple, songs, guitars. And similarly to the Shakuhachi, when I entered into this world, I instinctively felt to go much deeper into it. And so I found myself a short time after that actually living in Brazil and becoming deeply immersed in these kinds of forest rituals. And I became so absorbed in the music, almost by a kind of process of musical osmosis. The music, the songs that these people were singing, they began to live so deeply inside of me that I began to receive my own versions of these songs. And in the beginning, I didn't really understand what was happening. But then I started to realize that a kind of a channel was opening inside of me where I was receiving messages in the format of these kinds of songs. And this aspect of my musical journey and my healing journey began about 25 years ago. And since that time, I have sustained an interest in these healing practices, and I've started to receive more and more songs of this nature. And for a long time, my musical life was really on two parallel tracks that didn't really connect or cross over. I played the shakuhachi, I played other instruments in musical projects, and then I had my private practice with these healing ceremonies that was not really any part of my professional musical life or the other musical collaborations I was doing with professional musicians. But more recently, I have felt that these songs that I've received are something that I really wish to share with the world in a broader sense, not simply to keep them within the context of these ceremonial settings of healing rituals. And so slowly over the past few years, and particularly over the past few months, I've been realigning my energies towards making beautiful recordings of these songs. And these two parallel aspects of my musical life have become merged into one path. And this is very exciting for me. It's something that feels like a new venture and a new way of me being able to feel that all the different aspects of my musicality become merged into one voice and one project.
So with all of that in mind, we have a little bit of a special announcement to make that the very latest, and I'll let Adrian describe this for us, but the very latest collection of such songs is shortly to be released on a new album. And there will be a preview through a live stream on the 25th of November. Adrian, share more with everybody.
Yeah, the album is called Trust in the Path, which is very much a reflection of my decision to just trust in my own unfolding path. It's a collection of 10 songs, and I'm playing the guitar, I'm singing, I'm playing my Japanese flute in the background, and a good friend of mine called Misha Mulov Obado, who is a great double bass player, and actually the son of the great conductor Claudio Obado. He's playing the double bass on the tracks, and another friend called Mike Stanton is helping me with some of the guitar parts. And so I'm very happy to reach the point where I'm releasing my first album of songs after 10 albums of instrumental music. And on November the 25th, I will be presenting a live stream singing through all of the 10 songs on the album.
So we have unfortunately lost Adrian due to some technical challenges. He is in another very different part of the world right now. And because of technical challenges, Adrian has now left our little conversation here. But what a fascinating journey into mindfulness within music. Just really sort of to almost conceive of music in a very different way, to think of music as a very different kind of conduit for our sort of being present, our awakening. If you're on some kind of spiritual journey, then clearly music has probably already played a big part for you. But for the rest of us who have loved music since probably before, as Adrian said, the day we were born, we were even aware of sound and music. Maybe there's a new way of actually experiencing it as part of some really good daily habits and good mindful ways of being present in every day. But do have a little think about that little analogy that I came up with as we were talking with Adrian, because one of the key things for me is very much the difference between this new kind of almost silent version of music, or the kind of little pauses after some of Adrian's pieces, where you just sit and you wait in that moment, and there's nothing, and that nothing is just a thing of absolute pleasure. There is nothing there. So, let's not overthink this. This is an incredible opportunity to explore maybe a different view of the concept of music.